The pencil sketch trembled in Marcus Chen's calloused hands as he stared at a face he thought he'd never see again. Coffee shop noise faded to white static around him. The careful shading, the gentle curve of a smile he'd once known by heart, the eyes that had haunted his dreams for a decade, all rendered in the unmistakable strokes of a child's hand. But this wasn't just any child. This was 7-year-old Lily Hartwell, daughter of Victoria Hartwell, the billionaire CEO, whose gleaming corporate tower Marcus cleaned every night. The same Lily who hadn't spoken a single word in the 3 years since her father's death. The same Lily who had just placed this impossible drawing in his hands and was now watching his face with knowing eyes that seemed far too old for her small frame. "Where did you see this face, sweetheart?" "Ah," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible over the hammering of his heart. Lily's lips remained sealed, but she reached into her backpack and pulled out another drawing. Then another. A dozen sketches of the same woman, each one more detailed than the last. The same woman who had disappeared from his life 10 years ago without explanation, leaving behind only a letter that had shattered his world into pieces he was still trying to reassemble. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The morning had started like any other in Marcus's carefully structured life. His alarm buzzed at 5:30 in his cramped studio apartment above Chen's Corner Market, the bodega his late parents had run for 30 years before the neighborhood gentrified around them. He moved through his routine with practiced efficiency: shower, coffee, check on his sleeping 8-year-old son David, leave a note reminding the boy to eat breakfast, and catch the school bus. At 42, Marcus carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had learned to find worth in honest work, even when the world insisted on measuring success differently. His janitorial uniform was always pressed, his equipment meticulously organized. He took pride in leaving every office floor spotless, every window streak-free. It was honest work that paid the bills and kept David fed, clothed, and in a decent school district. But 3 mornings a week, Marcus allowed himself one small luxury. He would stop by Sunrise Cafe on his way home from his overnight shift at Hartwell Industries, not for the overpriced coffee, he couldn't afford that, but for the free Wi-Fi and the chance to sketch in the margins of his worn notebook while the morning crowd rushed past in their tailored suits and clicking heels. Sketching had been his escape since childhood, his way of making sense of a world that often felt too sharp around the edges. In college, before everything fell apart, his art professors had called his work emotionally intuitive and professionally promising. That felt like someone else's life now. This particular Wednesday morning, Marcus had chosen his usual corner table near the window, pulling out his notebook and a stub of charcoal pencil. The cafe hummed with the familiar symphony of espresso machines and muted conversations. He was halfway through, sketching the barista's concentrated expression, when a small shadow fell across his table. Lily Hartwell stood beside his chair, still in her private school uniform, navy blazer, pleated skirt, patent leather shoes that probably cost more than Marcus made in a month. Her strawberry blonde hair was pulled back in a perfect ponytail, but her green eyes held a depth of sadness that made Marcus's chest tighten with recognition. He'd seen her before, of course. During his night shifts, cleaning the executive floors of Hartwell Industries, he'd occasionally glimpsed family photos on Victoria Hartwell's desk. But seeing Lily in person was different. She was smaller than he'd expected, more fragile, with an otherworldly stillness that seemed to create its own gravity. "Hello there," Marcus said softly, closing his notebook instinctively. "Are you here with your mom?" Lily nodded toward the counter where Victoria Hartwell stood with her back to them, speaking in clipped tones into her phone. Even from across the cafe, Victoria commanded attention. Her charcoal gray suit was impeccably tailored, her dark hair swept into a flawless chignon. She moved with the controlled precision of someone accustomed to having every minute scheduled, every decision carrying weight. Marcus had observed Victoria from a distance during his cleaning shifts. She was often the last person to leave the building, her office light glowing like a beacon, while the rest of the 37th floor fell dark around her. He'd noticed the way she held her shoulders rigid with responsibility, and the way she touched the silver locket at her throat, when she thought no one was watching. "Is everything okay?" Marcus asked Lily, who had made no move to return to her mother's side. Instead, Lily reached into her small backpack and withdrew a sketch pad. She flipped through several pages before stopping on one particular drawing. Without a word, she turned the pad toward Marcus. The pencil sketch showed a woman's face rendered with surprising skill for a child's hand. The features were delicate but strong, framed by waves of long hair, but it was the eyes that made Marcus's world tilt sideways. He knew those eyes, had traced their shape with his fingertips in another lifetime, had searched for them in crowded rooms for years after they'd vanished from his life. "Where?" Marcus's voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Where did you see this person, Lily?" But Lily was already reaching into her backpack again, pulling out more drawings. A woman reading a book, the same woman laughing, her head thrown back with joy. The woman's hands, detailed down to a thin scar across the left knuckle that Marcus remembered all too well. Each sketch was signed in careful block letters. Sarah M. Marcus felt the cafe spinning around him. Sarah Martinelli, the name he'd whispered in empty rooms for 10 years. The woman who had shared his tiny apartment near Columbia University, who had fallen asleep reading art history textbooks while he worked on his thesis. The woman who had loved his drawings almost as much as she loved the stories behind them. The woman who had disappeared without explanation 3 days before their wedding. "I don't understand," Marcus whispered, more to himself than to Lily. "How do you know Sarah?" Lily's green eyes studied his face with startling intensity. She reached for her sketch pad again, flipping to a fresh page. With quick, sure strokes, she began to draw. Not Sarah this time, but Marcus himself. His jaw with its slight stubble, the lines around his eyes earned through years of night shifts and single parenthood, the way his dark hair curled at his collar because he couldn't afford regular haircuts. When she finished, she tore the page from the pad and handed it to him. Then she pointed to herself and mouthed a single, silent word. "Daddy." The world stopped. Marcus stared at the drawing in his hands, then at Lily's face, searching for familiar features through the haze of shock. The shape of her nose. Yes, that could be Sarah's. The way she held her left shoulder slightly higher than her right. Sarah had done that when she was thinking. And her hands, small and graceful, moving with an artist's precision as she drew. "Lily!" Victoria's sharp voice cut through Marcus's spiraling thoughts. "What are you doing?" "We need to go." Marcus looked up to see Victoria striding toward them, her expression shifting from irritation to confusion as she registered her daughter's proximity to a stranger. Her gaze flicked to Marcus's janitorial uniform, and he watched her features harden with the automatic dismissal he'd grown accustomed to from people in her world. "I'm sorry if she bothered you," Victoria said crisply, reaching for Lily's hand. "She's not supposed to wander off." "She wasn't bothering me," Marcus managed, his voice sounding foreign to his own ears. "We were just talking about art." Victoria's laugh held no warmth. "Lily doesn't talk. She hasn't spoken in 3 years. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He looked down at Lily, who was watching him with those eerily knowing eyes, and felt something crack open in his chest. A mute child who drew pictures of his lost love with impossible accuracy. a little girl who had just drawn his portrait and called him Daddy, without making a sound. "Mrs. Hartwell," Marcus said carefully, "I think we need to leave," Victoria interrupted, her tone brooking no argument. She tugged gently at Lily's hand, but the child didn't budge. Instead, Lily reached into her backpack one final time and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. She pressed it into Marcus's palm before allowing her mother to lead her away. Marcus sat frozen as mother and daughter disappeared through the cafe's glass doors into the morning bustle of Manhattan. Only when they were completely out of sight did he unfold the paper Lily had given him. It was another drawing, simpler than the others but somehow more devastating. Two stick figures holding hands, one tall, one small, standing beneath a carefully drawn sun. At the bottom, in the same careful block letters, Lily had written. His mind reeled with impossible connections and unanswerable questions. How could Victoria Hartwell's mute daughter know Sarah's face? Why had she drawn him with such accuracy? And what did it mean that this child, this beautiful, silent child, seemed to be reaching across an inexplicable divide to find him? The answer, when it came to him 3 hours later, as he lay sleepless in his narrow bed, was so shocking that he sat bolt upright in the pre-dawn darkness. 10 years ago, Sarah had vanished from his life without explanation. 3 days before their wedding, she had left him a letter saying she couldn't marry him, that she needed to disappear, that he would never understand. He had searched for her everywhere, called her friends, her family, even hired a private investigator with money he didn't have. But Sarah Martinelli had vanished as completely as if she had never existed. 7 years ago, Victoria Hartwell had married tech mogul Jonathan Hartwell in what the society pages called the wedding of the century. Marcus remembered seeing the photos in the newspaper, feeling a distant pang at the bride's happiness. He hadn't looked closely at the woman's face then. He'd had no reason to. But now, sitting in his dark apartment with Lily's drawings spread across his small kitchen table, Marcus forced himself to remember every detail of that wedding photo. The bride's smile, her elegant pose, the way she held her bouquet, the way she had worn her dark hair in elaborate curls that obscured most of her face, the way she had looked nothing at all like the Sarah Martinelli he had loved. But what if she had been trying to look different? What if the elaborate styling, the professional makeup, the careful positioning had been deliberate camouflage? Marcus pulled out his phone with trembling fingers and searched for images of Victoria Hartwell. Photo after photo filled his screen. Corporate headshots, charity gala appearances, business magazine covers. In every single image, Victoria's hair was styled differently than Sarah's had been. Shorter, darker, sleeker. Her makeup was always flawless, professionally applied in a way that subtly altered the shape of her features. But in one image, a candid shot taken at a children's hospital charity event, Victoria was leaning down to speak with a young patient. The angle caught her. Profile. And for just a moment, with her hair falling naturally around her face and no practiced smile for the cameras, she looked exactly like the woman who had shared his bed and his dreams 10 years ago. Marcus stared at the photo until his eyes watered, his heart hammering against his ribs. It was impossible. It was insane. But as he looked at Lily's drawing of Sarah's face, drawn with the unconscious accuracy that only comes from daily familiarity, he began to understand that impossible and insane didn't mean untrue. Victoria Hartwell, billionaire CEO and Manhattan's most powerful businesswoman, was Sarah Martinelli. The woman who had disappeared from his life without explanation had been living 30 floors above his head for the past 3 years, close enough to touch, but separated by a chasm of wealth and secrets that might as well have been an ocean. And somehow, her daughter, their daughter, if his growing suspicion was correct, had found a way to bridge that gap with nothing more than pencil sketches and a silent plea for help. Marcus pressed his face into his hands and tried to process the magnitude of what he was contemplating. If Victoria was Sarah, then Lily's timing made perfect sense. Born 7.5 years ago, just 2.5 years after Sarah's disappearance. The right age, the right timeline, the right eyes, looking at him with recognition that went deeper than a child's innocent curiosity. Outside his window, New York was beginning to wake up. Soon he would need to shower and dress, get David ready for school, begin another day of pretending that his world hadn't just turned inside out. But first, he needed to look at one more thing. Marcus pulled out his own sketchbook and flipped to the very back, where he kept the drawings he'd never shown anyone. Self-portraits from his college days, studies of hands and faces, and there, hidden beneath years of accumulated sketches, a drawing he'd made of Sarah sleeping on a Sunday morning 10 years ago. He placed it next to Lily's drawing of the same face, and his last doubt evaporated. The woman in both pictures was unmistakably the same person, separated only by time and the kind of transformation that money and desperation could buy. Victoria Hartwell was Sarah Martinelli, and Lily, beautiful, silent, impossibly perceptive Lily, was his daughter. Marcus stood outside the gleaming glass facade of Hartwell Industries at 11:47 that night. His cleaning cart, loaded with supplies that suddenly felt like props in an elaborate deception. For 3 years, he had mopped these floors, emptied these trash cans, and polished these windows without truly seeing the woman whose empire surrounded him. Now, every surface seemed to whisper Sarah's name. The security guard, Miguel, waved him through with the same tired nod he'd given for months. "Evening, Marcus. 37th floor again?" "Just the executive level tonight," Marcus replied, his voice steadier than he felt. He'd called in a favor to switch his usual route, claiming the day shift had missed some areas. In truth, he needed access to Victoria's office when she wasn't there. Needed to search for any trace of the woman he'd once known. The elevator ride to the 37th floor felt eternal. Marcus watched the numbers climb and tried to organize his thoughts into something resembling a plan. He couldn't simply knock on Victoria's door and demand answers. If she truly was Sarah, there had to be a reason she'd disappeared so completely, transformed herself so thoroughly, a reason dangerous enough to abandon the life they'd built together. The executive floor at midnight was a different world from the bustling corporate hive it became during business hours. Emergency lighting cast long shadows across empty corridors. The silence was so complete that Marcus could hear the building's bones settling around him. The whisper of ventilation systems breathing life into empty spaces. Victoria's corner office occupied the building's northeast corner, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city that never truly slept. Marcus had cleaned this space hundreds of times, but tonight he approached it like an archaeologist entering a tomb, searching for artifacts that might unlock a decade-old mystery. He began methodically, the way Sarah had taught him to approach his art. Observe everything. Assume nothing. Let the details speak for themselves. Victoria's desk was immaculate. Its surface cleared except for a laptop, a crystal paperweight, and a single framed photograph of Lily at what looked like a school art show. But it was the second photograph that made Marcus's breath catch. Partially hidden behind the laptop screen stood a smaller frame, containing a picture he'd never noticed before. Jonathan Hartwell, Victoria's late husband, stood with his arm around his wife at what appeared to be their wedding reception. But Victoria's face in the photo was turned slightly away from the camera, her expression distant despite the celebratory setting. Marcus studied the image more closely and felt his pulse quicken. In the background, barely visible among the wedding guests, stood a woman who looked remarkably like Sarah, as he remembered her same hair, same build, same way of holding her shoulders when she was nervous. But that was impossible. Unless she had a sister, Marcus whispered to the empty office. Sarah had mentioned Elena exactly once during their 2 years together, describing her as the twin sister she'd lost touch with after their parents' death. Twin sisters who could have easily passed for each other with the right styling, the right clothes, the right motivation to disappear. The possibility hit him like a physical blow. What if Sarah hadn't transformed herself into Victoria Hartwell? What if she had simply taken her sister's place? Marcus moved to the bookshelf that dominated the office's west wall, scanning the titles with new purpose. Business texts, leadership guides, market analysis reports, exactly what he'd expect from a corporate CEO. But on the bottom shelf, almost hidden behind a stack of quarterly reports, he found something that stopped his heart. The Art of Memory. Renaissance Techniques for Modern Artists. Sarah's book. The one she'd been reading the night before she disappeared. The one she'd left bookmarked on page 143 with a pressed violet he'd picked for her from Central Park. Marcus pulled the volume from the shelf with shaking hands and let it fall open naturally. And there, pressed between the pages like a whisper from another life, was a violet so faded it was almost colorless. The book slipped from Marcus's fingers and hit the floor with a soft thud that seemed to echo through the silent office. He knelt to retrieve it, and found a handwritten note tucked into the back cover, written in the careful script he'd once known better than his own. If you're reading this, then she found you. I pray she's safe. I pray you can forgive me. The truth is in the music box, the one I gave you for your birthday. Find it, and you'll understand why I had to disappear, why I couldn't take you with me, why loving you meant leaving you behind. S. Marcus stared at the note until the letters blurred. The music box Sarah referenced had been destroyed in a fire that consumed his apartment 6 months after she left, taking with it most of his possessions and all of his remaining hope that she might return. He'd never known what secrets it might have contained. Looking for something specific? The voice from the doorway sent adrenaline shooting through Marcus's veins. He spun around to find Victoria Hartwell standing in the office entrance, no longer the polished CEO he'd seen that morning, but a woman in jeans and a worn Columbia University sweatshirt that he recognized with devastating clarity. Sarah's sweatshirt, the one she'd stolen from his closet. Their first week living together, the one she'd worn while painting her nails on Sunday mornings, and reading him passages from whatever book had captured her imagination. For a moment, neither of them moved. Marcus remained kneeling beside the scattered book and pressed violet, while Victoria Sarah stood frozen in the doorway like a deer caught in headlights. The years fell away between them, and for one heartbreaking instant, they were 28 again, discovering love in a cramped graduate student apartment where the heat barely worked and the future stretched ahead like an unmarked canvas. "Hello, Marcus," Sarah said finally, her voice carrying the same slightly husky quality that had once whispered his name in the darkness. "Hello, Sarah." He stood slowly, the note still clutched in his hand. "Or should I call you Victoria now?" She stepped into the office and closed the door behind her, her movements careful and controlled. "How long have you, known?" "Since this morning, since your daughter handed me a drawing of your face and called me Daddy." Sarah's composure cracked slightly at that, her hand moving instinctively to the silver locket at her throat. "Lily showed you the drawings?" "Multiple drawings. Very detailed ones." Marcus moved closer, studying her face for any trace of the deception he'd been blind to for so long. "She has your gift for seeing people as they really are, even when they're trying to hide." "She's not supposed to." Sarah caught herself, shook her head. "She's never shown those drawings to anyone before." Maybe she's tired of keeping secrets. Marcus held up the note he'd found. Like this one. What truth was in the music box, Sarah? What was so dangerous that you had to fake your own death and steal your sister's life? The question hung between them like a blade. Sarah moved to the windows, staring out at the city that sprawled below them. When she spoke, her voice was so quiet, Marcus had to strain to hear it. Elena was already dead when I took her identity. She'd been killed 3 days before our wedding, murdered by the same people who were hunting me. Taking her place was the only way to survive. The words hit Marcus like ice water. Hunting you? For what? For what I witnessed. Sarah turned back to him, and he could see the weight of 10 years' worth of secrets in her eyes. Elena worked for a pharmaceutical company, Meridian Labs. She discovered they were falsifying clinical trial data, allowing a drug that caused birth defects to move toward FDA approval. She tried to expose them, and they killed her for it. Marcus felt the room spinning around him. And you saw it happen? I was supposed to meet Elena for lunch that day. I arrived early and saw them push her off the parking garage. It was supposed to look like suicide, but I watched the whole thing. 3 men in suits, completely professional. They saw me watching and chased me. But I managed to get away. So you disappeared. I ran. Sarah's voice broke slightly. I was so scared, Marcus. These people had unlimited resources. Government connections. They could make anyone disappear. I couldn't come to you because I couldn't put you in danger. I couldn't marry you because I couldn't live with your blood on my hands if they found me. Marcus stepped closer, his anger warring with understanding. So you let me think you'd stopped loving me. Let me believe I'd done something wrong. It was easier than the truth. If you'd known why I was leaving, you would have tried to help. You would have insisted on coming with me or going to the police, and they would have killed you for it. The brutal logic of her choice was starting to make sense, but it didn't ease the ache of 10 lost years. How did you become Victoria Hartwell? Elena and I were twins. We'd practiced impersonating each other as children switched classes, fooled teachers, drove our parents crazy. When she died, I realized I could become her completely. She'd been engaged to Jonathan Hartwell, a tech mogul who spent more time with his computers than his fiancée. He barely knew the real Elena. So you married him? I survived him, Sarah corrected. Jonathan was kind, but distant. He wanted a trophy wife for business functions and someone to manage his social calendar. It was a performance I could sustain, and his wealth gave me the resources to disappear completely, to create a new identity that even Meridian Labs couldn't penetrate. Marcus absorbed this, pieces of an impossible puzzle clicking into place. And Lily? Sarah's expression softened for the first time since entering the office. Jonathan couldn't have children. A childhood illness. When I told him I was pregnant, he was overjoyed. He assumed it was a miracle. And I let him believe it. But she's mine. Yours. The admission hung between them like a bridge, finally thrown across a decade-wide chasm. I was already pregnant when I left you, Marcus. I didn't know it then, didn't realize until 2 weeks after I'd disappeared. By then, it was too late to tell you without destroying everything I'd sacrificed to keep you safe. Marcus felt his knees nearly give way. You carried my child alone, raised her alone. Not alone. Jonathan loved her from the moment she was born. He was a good father, even if he wasn't her biological one. When he died in that car accident 3 years ago, Lily lost the only father she'd ever known. That's when she stopped speaking. The trauma of losing him, combined with the confusion of mourning a man who looked nothing like her. Sarah's voice trailed off. She drew my face because she was looking for her real father. Children see more than we think they do. Lily always stared at mirrors longer than normal kids, like she was searching for something familiar. When she started drawing faces, they were always the same type: dark hair, strong jawline, eyes like yours. I thought it was coincidence until she drew that perfect portrait of you yesterday. Marcus moved to Sarah's side at the window, studying her reflection in the glass. The expensive styling and professional makeup couldn't entirely hide the woman he'd once known, but the differences were stark enough that he understood how she'd maintained her deception for so long. The voice coaching, the posture training, the slight accent you've developed. How much of Victoria is performance? All of it, Sarah admitted. Every morning I wake up and put on Victoria Hartwell like a costume. The only time I feel like myself is when I'm alone with Lily. And even then, I have to be careful. If anyone discovered the truth, Meridian Labs would come for you. Meridian Labs was absorbed by a larger conglomerate 5 years ago, but the people involved are still out there. Still powerful, still dangerous. Jonathan's death wasn't an accident, Marcus. Someone's been getting closer to the truth. The revelation sent a chill through Marcus that had nothing to do with the office's air conditioning. You think they killed him? I know they did. The brake lines in his car were cut, made to look like mechanical failure, and there have been other incidents, a break-in at our house that the police dismissed as random crime, phone calls where no one speaks, cars following Lily to school. Someone knows who I really am. Marcus turned to face her fully, seeing the exhaustion and fear she'd been hiding beneath Victoria Hartwell's polished exterior. Then, why are you still here? Why haven't you disappeared again? Because of her. Sarah's voice was fierce with maternal protection. Lily is 7 years old. She needs stability, friends, a home. I can't keep running forever. And I can't ask her to live in hiding for crimes she didn't commit. Jonathan left us his fortune, but more importantly, he left us his name. Victoria Hartwell has resources and connections that Sarah Martinelli never did. If I'm going to fight back, this is my best chance. Fight back how? Sarah moved to her desk and pulled out a thick folder hidden beneath the quarterly reports. I've been gathering evidence for 3 years. Documentation of Meridian Labs' cover-up. Financial records showing payoffs to FDA officials. Communication logs proving the conspiracy. Everything Elena died trying to expose. Marcus opened the folder and felt his breath catch. Hundreds of pages of meticulously organized documents, photographs, recorded conversations. This is enough to bring down half the pharmaceutical industry. If it reaches the right people, but getting it there safely, protecting Lily while I testify, ensuring that justice is served without getting us all killed, that requires more than just evidence. It requires allies. What kind of allies? Sarah met his eyes, and for the first time since entering the office, she looked genuinely vulnerable. The kind who would risk everything to protect someone they love, even if that someone disappeared from their life without explanation 10 years ago. The request hung between them, unspoken but unmistakable. She was asking for his help, asking him to step into a world of danger and deception that could cost him everything. But as Marcus looked at this woman who had once been his entire world, who had sacrificed their love to keep him safe, who had raised their daughter alone while building a fortress of lies around them both, he realized the choice had already been made. What do you need me to do? Relief flooded Sarah's features. I need you to get close to Lily legitimately. She's been asking about you since yesterday, not directly, since she doesn't speak, but through her drawings and gestures. If I suddenly start bringing you around, it will raise questions. But if you happen to encounter us in public places, if a friendship develops naturally, I become part of your security network without anyone realizing it. Exactly. And Marcus? Sarah reached into her desk. drawer and pulled out a small object wrapped in tissue paper. I managed to save this from the music box before I disappeared. Marcus unwrapped the tissue to reveal a tiny silver charm in the shape of a violin, the one he'd given Sarah on their 6-month anniversary because she'd mentioned loving the sound of street musicians. Inside the violin's hollow body, visible through a small crystal window, was a microfilm chip no bigger than a pinhead. Elena hid copies of her evidence everywhere she could think of, including inside my jewelry. This contains proof of the pharmaceutical conspiracy and a list of everyone involved. It's our insurance policy. Marcus closed his fingers around the charm, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. When do we start? Tomorrow. Obviously, tomorrow. Lily has a checkup at Mount Sinai Children's Hospital. Dr. Rebecca Torres, the pediatric psychologist, trying to help her find her voice again. If you happen to be in the hospital cafeteria around 2 o'clock, I'll be there. Marcus pocketed the violin charm and moved toward the door. Sarah? Why now? After all these years of hiding? Why are you ready to trust me with this? She was quiet for so long, he thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a sadness that seemed to fill the entire office. Because Lily drew your face before she ever met you, Marcus. Because our daughter has been searching for her father through her art for 3 years. And yesterday, she finally found you. Because I'm tired of being afraid, and she's tired of being silent, and we both deserve a chance at the family we should have had all along. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Marcus left the Hartwell Industries building at 2:30 in the morning, with his world completely transformed. The man who had entered as a simple janitor now carried the weight of a decade-old conspiracy, the knowledge of a love that had never truly died, and the responsibility of protecting a daughter he'd only just discovered. But as he walked through the empty streets toward his apartment, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in 10 years. Hope. Not the desperate, grasping hope of a man searching for what he'd lost, but the steady, determined hope of a father, ready to fight for his family's future. Tomorrow, he would meet Lily again. Tomorrow, he would begin the delicate process of building a relationship with a daughter who had been calling to him through her art since the day she was old enough to hold a pencil. And tomorrow, he would start planning how to give Sarah Martinelli her life back, how to make Victoria Hartwell disappear safely, and how to ensure that their little family would never have to live in fear again. The truth, after 10 years of lies, was finally beginning to set them all free. The truth. An gunshot shattered the afternoon quiet of Mount Sinai Children's Hospital at exactly 2:43, sending patients and staff diving for cover as Marcus threw himself across the cafeteria table to shield Lily from the chaos erupting around them. Glass exploded inward from the street-facing windows, and through the jagged opening stepped 2 men in dark suits who moved with the professional efficiency of people accustomed to violence. "Where is she?" the taller man shouted, his weapon trained on the terrified crowd. "Victoria Hartwell, we know she's here." Marcus felt Lily's small body trembling against his chest as they crouched behind the overturned table. Her green eyes, so like Sarah's, were wide with terror. But there was something else there, too. Recognition. She knew these faces from nightmares, from half-remembered fragments of the day her father Jonathan had died. 3 hours earlier, the afternoon had begun with such promise. Marcus had arrived at the hospital cafeteria at exactly 2 o'clock, carrying a sketchbook and wearing his most casual clothes to blend in with the other waiting families. He'd positioned himself at a corner table with clear sightlines to the entrance, his heart hammering as he waited for his first legitimate meeting with his daughter since discovering the truth. When Sarah, still perfectly styled as Victoria Hartwell, had entered with Lily at 2:15, Marcus felt his breath catch. In the harsh hospital lighting, without the barriers of wealth and corporate power between them, she looked heartbreakingly like the woman he'd fallen in love with a lifetime ago. Lily walked beside her mother with the careful posture of a child accustomed to being watched. But her eyes scanned the room restlessly until they found Marcus. Their recognition was instant and electric. Lily's face had lit up with a smile that transformed her entire being, and she'd tugged insistently at her mother's hand until Sarah looked in Marcus's direction. The moment their eyes met across the crowded cafeteria, 10 years of separation collapsed into nothing. Lily had whispered the first word she'd spoken to her mother in 3 years. "It's him." Sarah's carefully maintained composure had cracked at the sound of her daughter's voice. She'd stood frozen for several seconds before allowing Lily to lead her across the cafeteria to Marcus's table. The conversation that followed had been stilted, careful, performed for any potential observers, but underneath the surface politeness, electricity crackled between them. "Thank you for what you did yesterday," Sarah had said formally. "Lily hasn't stopped drawing since she met you." "She's very talented," Marcus had replied, equally careful. "Would she like to see some of my sketches?" "Permission granted." Marcus had opened his sketchbook to a drawing he'd made that morning. Lily, sitting in the hospital waiting room, captured from memory with the kind of detail that only comes from a parent's love. Lily's eyes had widened with delight, and she'd reached for her own sketchpad, pulling out a new drawing of the three of them standing together like a family. It was while Marcus was studying this impossible, hopeful image that the hospital's security system had failed. Later, investigators would discover that the failure wasn't technical, but human. 2 guards paid off. Cameras disabled, emergency protocols mysteriously delayed. But in the moment, as armed men stormed through the cafeteria demanding Sarah's surrender, Marcus understood only that his family was in mortal danger. "Victoria Hartwell, fosterers, haventessable tan." The gunman called again, his voice echoing off the tile walls. "We know you're here. Come out now, and no one else gets hurt." Marcus felt Sarah tense beside him, her hand moving instinctively toward her purse, where he knew she kept the evidence that could destroy Meridian Labs. For 10 years, she'd lived with the knowledge that these men would eventually find her. Now that moment had arrived, and the choice was stark: surrender and die, or fight and risk everyone around them. "Stay down," Marcus whispered to Lily, then caught Sarah's eye. In that glance, they communicated everything: their love, their regret, their determination to protect their daughter, no matter the cost. Sarah stood slowly, her hands raised. "I'm Victoria Hartwell." The gunman swung toward her, his weapon trained on her chest. "Where's the evidence?" "The files Elena stole from Meridian Labs." "Elena's been dead for 10 years, Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "Whatever she stole died with her." The man smiled coldly. "We know better. We know you've been building a case, gathering documents, preparing to destroy everything we've built. The pharmaceutical industry is worth $500 billion annually. We're not going to let one woman's conscience bring it down." From behind the overturned table, Marcus watched the scene unfold with growing horror. He could see Lily clutching her sketchpad, her small fingers working frantically across the page, even in the midst of terror. She was drawing again. Not the careful portraits she'd shown him before, but something urgent, desperate, important. "You killed my sister," Sarah said, taking a step toward the gunman. "You killed my husband when he started asking questions. How many others have you murdered to protect your profits?" "Enough." The gunman's finger tightened on the trigger. "Where are the files?" That's when Lily stood up. The 7-year-old girl rose from behind the overturned table like a small, fierce angel. her sketch pad clutched against her chest. She looked directly at the gunman and spoke in a clear, strong voice that carried through the entire cafeteria. "You can't have them!" The words stopped everyone in the room. Sarah gasped, tears streaming down her face at the sound of her daughter's voice. Marcus felt his heart break and soar simultaneously. But Lily wasn't finished. "My daddy has them," she continued, pointing directly at Marcus. "And he's going to make sure everyone knows what you did." The gunman's attention shifted to Marcus, who realized with crystal clarity that his daughter had just made him a target to save her mother. He stood slowly, his hands raised, drawing the weapon away from both Sarah and Lily. "Smart girl," the gunman said. "Call him over here." "Lily?" "No," Sarah breathed, understanding her daughter's sacrifice. But Lily was already moving, walking around the table toward Marcus, with the fearless determination of a child who had finally found her voice and intended to use it. She reached into her sketchpad and pulled out the drawing she'd been working on. Not a portrait this time, but a detailed map of the hospital layout, with exits marked and escape routes highlighted. "Daddy," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word, "I drew this for you." Marcus took the paper with hands that barely trembled, understanding immediately what his brilliant daughter had given him. She'd mapped every exit, every stairwell, every potential escape route in the building. But more than that, she'd marked the locations where hospital security typically stationed guards, where cameras had clear sightlines, and where a person might hide if they needed to disappear. "Very touching," the gunman snarled, "but it won't help you. Give me the evidence, and maybe the girl lives long enough to see her next birthday." That's when Marcus understood what he had to do. "The evidence isn't in this building," he said clearly, his voice carrying to every corner of the cafeteria. "It's already been delivered to the FBI, the Justice Department, and the Washington Post. Killing us won't stop what's already in motion." The lie was perfect in its simplicity, and the gunman's expression shifted from confidence to uncertainty. But before he could respond, the hospital's delayed security protocols finally activated. Alarms began blaring, emergency doors sealed automatically, and the sound of police sirens filled the air outside. In the chaos that followed police storming the building, gunmen attempting to escape, terrified families fleeing for safety. Marcus grabbed both Sarah and Lily, following the escape route his daughter had mapped. They made it to a service stairwell before the first gunman could pursue them, descended 2 floors to an abandoned radiology wing, and emerged through a loading dock into the afternoon sunlight. But they weren't free yet. As they reached Marcus's car in the hospital parking garage, the second gunman appeared from behind a concrete pillar, his weapon already raised. "End of the line," he said. That's when Lily stepped forward again. The 7-year-old girl, who had been silent for 3 years, looked directly at the man who had murdered her father and spoke with the clear, unwavering voice of someone who had finally found something worth fighting for. "My name is Lily Chen," she said, using Marcus's surname with deliberate intent. "My mommy's real name is Sarah Martinelli, and you killed my daddy Jonathan because he found out about the medicine that hurts babies." The gunman hesitated, confused by the child's unexpected confession. In that moment of uncertainty, Marcus lunged forward, tackling the armed man to the concrete. The weapon skittered across the garage floor as they struggled. But Marcus had the advantage of desperation, the fury of a father protecting his family. When police arrived 90 seconds later, they found Marcus sitting on top of the subdued gunman, while Sarah held Lily in her arms, both mother and daughter crying with relief and joy at the sound of that miraculous voice. But the crisis was far from over. The next 72 hours passed in a blur of police interviews, federal investigations, and media attention that threatened to expose everything Sarah had worked to hide. The evidence she'd been collecting for 3 years, hidden in safety deposit boxes encrypted files, and the memories of witnesses finally saw daylight as FBI agents built their case against the pharmaceutical conspiracy. Marcus found himself at the center of the storm, no longer a janitor, but a key witness whose testimony could help bring down a network of corruption that stretched across multiple industries. The violin charm Sarah had given him, containing Elena's original evidence, became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. But the real transformation was happening in a much quieter place. 3 weeks after the hospital attack, Marcus sat in the rebuilt greenhouse of what had once been the Anderson estate, now officially renamed the Chen Martinelli Family Foundation. Sarah had liquidated most of Victoria Hartwell's assets, keeping only enough to ensure their safety and fund their new mission: protecting whistleblowers and supporting families affected by pharmaceutical corruption. Lily perched on a stool beside him, chattering constantly as she worked on her latest drawing. A portrait of the three of them standing in their new home, which looked remarkably like the family picture she'd drawn in the hospital cafeteria a month ago. Her voice, once lost, now filled every corner of their lives with joy and wonder. "Daddy! Do you think Daddy Jonathan can see us from heaven?" Lily asked, pausing in her work. Marcus looked at Sarah, who was tending to tomato plants in the corner of the greenhouse. Not the perfect executive she'd been forced to become, but the gentle, passionate woman he'd fallen in love with years ago. She smiled at the question, her eyes bright with tears that came easily now that she no longer had to hide her emotions. "I think he can," Marcus said carefully, "and I think he's happy that you have a voice again, and that your mommy doesn't have to pretend to be someone else anymore. And that we're a family," Lily added matter-of-factly. "And that we're a family," Marcus agreed. Sarah joined them at the sketching table, settling into the chair beside Marcus with the easy intimacy of people who no longer had to hide their love. She looked at Lily's drawing and smiled. "What are you going to title this one?" Lily considered the question seriously, her small brow furrowed in concentration. Then her face brightened with inspiration. "Home," she said simply. "I'm going to call it Home." That evening, after Lily had fallen asleep between them in the large bed they now shared without shame or secrecy, Marcus and Sarah lay in the darkness talking about their future. The trials would be difficult months of testimony, media scrutiny, and the constant threat of retaliation from those who still wanted them silenced. But they would face it together, as a family, with the truth finally on their side. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked quietly. "Giving up your quiet life for all of this chaos?" Marcus thought about his answer carefully. He thought about the small apartment he'd shared with David, the simple routine of his janitorial work, the years of loneliness that had followed Sarah's disappearance. Then he thought about Lily's laughter filling their home, about the way Sarah smiled when she thought no one was watching, about the family they were building, from the ashes of their broken past. "Never," he said finally. "Some things are worth any price." 6 months later, Marcus stood in a federal courthouse in Manhattan, holding Lily's hand as they waited for the verdict in the pharmaceutical conspiracy trial. The little girl who had found her voice, just in time to help save her family, wore a blue dress and carried a small sketchbook filled with drawings of justice scales, courtrooms, and people telling the truth even when it was dangerous. When the jury foreman announced guilty verdicts on all counts, Lily squeezed Marcus's hand and whispered, "We did it, Daddy." But the real victory had happened much earlier, in a hospital cafeteria where a mute child had finally spoken up for the people she loved. In a greenhouse, where a woman had stopped pretending to be someone else. In the quiet moments when a family that had been scattered by lies and fear had chosen to trust in truth and love instead. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story. As they walked out of the courthouse together, Marcus, Sarah, and Lily, the little girl looked up at her parents and smiled. What should we draw next? Marcus and Sarah exchanged a look filled with all the love and hope they'd carried through 10 years of separation and sacrifice. The future stretched ahead of them like a blank canvas, waiting to be filled with all the stories they would create together. "Whatever you want, Princess," Marcus said, lifting his daughter onto his shoulders. "We have all the time in the world." And for the first time in 10 years, that felt completely, wonderfully true.